Go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 6. Dealing with, of course, what most would think of when they think of Genesis chapter 6, the flood. But why did the flood take place? What was going on? Was it, and I'm sorry to sound, I'm not that sorry, but to sound somewhat political, was it because mankind was doing such a horrible job of saving and preserving and taking care of the overall environment that God had to just destroy them? Was it political issues and God had to destroy the earth because of that? What was the underlying reason for God destroying the earth? It was sin. That will always be the issue as far as things that are wrong. Sin being dealt with. We come up with all these peripheral terms that describe things that don't call them sin, don't seem sin, errors, mistake, issues, undesirable circumstances. There's all kinds of ways we can phrase things to try to make it sound like it's just unfortunate things taking place, when in reality, at its core, it is sin. And this is why it does not do us well to come up with all kinds of other ways to explain around our sin. Typically, if we're going to deal with sin, we deal with the sins of others, but don't necessarily want to talk about our own sins. And that's where it needs to start. Because if it doesn't, sin obviously has the tendency to grow and increase. I think the phrasing my brother Rick used when he was speaking was, it wants to be found. Sin wants to be discovered. And it's true, definitely, of sin. It is desirous, as it were, if you want to personify it, because sin is something else separate to the devil, though the devil is obviously associated often with sin. Sin will compound itself over and over again, way beyond not only our control, but way beyond our expectations or anticipation. We cannot imagine the magnitude and the controlling power of sin. And one of the issues we have with sin is we think we can control the magnitude and the impact of our sin, but we cannot. It is all-encompassing, all-consuming, if given the chance. It's nothing to mess around with. But because we've so almost obliterated the idea of sin from vocabulary, even in our churches, people don't think they have sin, don't think they have sin issues. And that, of course, is dangerous in light of texts like we're dealing with tonight. Verse 1 of Genesis chapter 6, "Now it came about, when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose." Now it's interesting that it phrases it that way. One of the underlying issues here, as unpopular as this would be today, is they picked for themselves, in this case, husbands finding wives, whoever they wanted. They just picked somebody, and of course in this case it was because they were very attractive to them, and that was the most important thing to them. Typically the outward beauty of the young ladies, and then they just got married. That was the number one thing. As long as I find you attractive, then that makes for a good marriage. If I don't find you attractive, then either we don't get married, or, as we're seeing today, we just separate or divorce. So keep that in mind, because that's part of where this is headed. Verse 3, "Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. Typically pointing to that's all that mankind had left when God was saying this. Verse 4, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, and men of renown." This is the big controversial verse here, verse 4. Who were they? What was going on? Were they giants? Were they supernatural creatures? We discussed a little bit of that last week. But here is the issue. This is the issue. Verse 5, "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, how great, how significant, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time, continually. That's how bad. Not just the thoughts, but even the intentions behind them were always evil all the time. Sin had become all-consuming. They looked like it was a free-for-all. Just be as sinful as you can be, and that was then the whole purpose and aim of life. Fulfill every sinful inclination, desire, response that you possibly can fulfill. And that's where mankind had gone. And I phrase it that way because that's where our society is certainly heading, that's what your life is about. You want self-fulfillment. And of course, self-fulfillment has nothing to do with, these days, of fulfilling responsibility. Self-fulfillment is self-gratification. That's what it is just about, made itself out to be in our society. Verse 6, and the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. And the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found grace, favor in the eyes of the Lord. And then it goes on to give the particulars. So this is what sets it up. These are very important details. One of the things that I've noticed as I've gotten older is there seems to be an inclination where people want to hurry through text, probably just for interest's sake. And yet, there's always that nagging question, I wonder what we missed. I wonder what we've not thought about. I wonder why it used that word. I wonder why it's in that order. And questions like that, which may be seemingly just tedious to many people. But when they're crucial texts like this, when God destroys everybody but 8 people, seems like it would deserve our strict attention to detail. And then Peter references it as well, and then referencing in light of the ultimate destruction that's going to come again on the earth, seems like it would be something we'd want to search out in detail. In the notes, we had begun point B there, the conditions and circumstances that led up to the flood. So this is where we're at. We dealt with point number 1. As mankind was being blessed with children and the population began to grow significantly, sin also began to become more prevalent throughout society. And it's, I think, fair to stop, this is what I did when I was studying this out, and ask, so why was sin spreading at such a rapid rate? What was going on that would make this the case? This is what makes me interested in this, that sin was just going to a high level, and then you see what describes what was taking place, and then it talks about all the evil thoughts of mankind, and it talks about marriage. It talks about that intermarrying, as it were, which we'll get to, which again, a lot of people say, well, I think if they're supernatural beings, that was kind of a unique case, and so the takeaway point is don't marry demons. And it may sound funny, but when it comes down to it, what else are we going to conclude? Okay, I don't marry a demon. I mean, there's some people out there you kind of think might be demons, but I shouldn't marry a demon. But it's more than that. And once you see this indiscriminate marrying, and then this catering to whatever anybody desired, which has more than a hint there when it says they married whomever they chose. Again, why does it say it that way? Is this a case for arranged marriages? I won't go that far. But it certainly speaks against indiscriminate marrying, where we just marry out of attraction. Now, does that not sound wrong today? We marry just out of attraction, and typically it's physical or temporal or something like that. And I'm not downplaying that either. Obviously, I think it's pretty normal that if you're going to marry someone, you find them attractive somehow. But there are so many points of what ought to attract us, what ought to be our focus in this, that go beyond the surface. And that was the case here. They were just indiscriminate in their marrying, and then we see right in the same context, look how wicked mankind got. And this is why I do not personally believe, and we'll try to make a very solid case for it, that these were supernatural beings marrying women. And we'll bring up the text here in a moment. And the reason I'm going to fight hard isn't to argue necessarily my point, because I understand why they have these other viewpoints, but because I think it will put us in danger of missing a very important point. Because again, I don't think most of us are that nervous about marrying a demon. In this case, our young ladies marrying a demon. There's plenty of bad people out there, which also ought to be something we consider. But no, it's far more than that. Who are the sons of God? Who are the daughters of men? Why is it phrased this way? And I'll try to make a case why my particular strong leaning interpretation of this text fits the context wonderfully. And I'm going to even admit up front, it breaks one normal rule of exegesis, my stance. It breaks one normal rule of exegesis, but it fulfills another in the rules of exegesis. I'm setting you up. But it does honestly break one rule of exegesis, but fulfills another. And if that's not going to rope you in, I don't know what's going to rope you in. It's just key points like that, but we'll see. So the depravity of man was about to exhibit itself in an unrestrained manner, and that ought to be a terrifying concept. This is what ought to make us nervous about our society, is that sin is becoming unrestrained. That's more nerve-wracking than even a political force that seems to be irresponsible. But this is typical with the assumption of long life, lots of time to spare, and death appearing to be far off. We can see it even in our short lifetimes. And is compounded with the numbers advocating and practicing sin more openly. It's just the way things are. That is so common for people, especially young people, to look around and say, most people are okay with it. And they seem to be doing fine. Kind of the case of the mockers with Peter. Some of the Proverbs lend to this. It just looks like most people are fine with it. And that's always a safe rule of thumb, right? Most people are okay with it. And if most people are, and they seem to be doing okay, maybe God's word is a bit antiquated because it doesn't seem to line up with my instinctive desires. And quite often that's true. Quite often the scripture contradicts our instinctive desires for our own good. But too many people discover that way later, after so much damage is done. So here we are to the fun stuff. Let's get through this disagreement. See if I can convince you all to be on the same page as I am. Let's see if, and then just hear me out. There was a particular group, this is now just stating it in a general way. There was a particular group that became enamored with the, quote, daughters of men. This is in the first couple verses. There's been a great deal of debate over several centuries as to who exactly the sons of God are here in verse 2. And if any point has an understatement, that's it. This is one of the hot topics. I remember early on in my dad's preacher boys class, we're dealing with controversial texts. This was one of the first ones he brought up, that in Hebrews 6, to just throw some really tough ones at us. Really tough ones. He would give us an explanation. Well, that sounds reasonable. Then he'd give you another explanation. You think, well, wait a minute, that sounds reasonable too. I remember the Hebrews 6 text. He went at it, first of all, from looking like you could lose your salvation. Like, wow, that's pretty solid. Maybe, why is my dad telling us this? Because it sure sounds like we can lose our salvation. And then coming at it a whole other way with questions. And you think, well, wait a minute, yeah, I see that too in the text. So this is one of them. And I wish I could say it was just super easy to explain away now that I'm convinced that my viewpoint, and hopefully it's not just my viewpoint, but my viewpoint is correct. I can't see it any other way. The other way seems a bit foolish. But again, give me a chance. Let's see where we land. Point A, some put forward that these were angelic beings, and there's multiple ways of applying how these angelic beings were able to intermarry. but that these were angelic beings, and this term, the sons of God, as it's phrased here, was used as such, angelic beings, in Job 1:6, Job 2:1, Job 38:7, which is true. They are called the sons of God, the same phrasing, and people often say, well, which book was written before? Seems like Genesis was written before. It's highly likely that Job was written even before Genesis, but either way, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Even if you can say Job sets the precedence, then we still have another issue that I'm about to pull up. So that this group, these sons of God that are angelic beings, either actually marrying and having children with these women, which most of the people that I've heard that are fairly conservative say, well, that can't really be, that they could somehow actually reproduce children. And we'll explain that too in a moment. Or possessing the men and then having children by them. And I'm still a little bit perplexed how that could necessarily have supernatural children. And even if they were giant children out of this, they were still human beings. They were still people. And you don't need superhuman people to make this account worth anything. You just don't need it. That's one of the parts that frustrates me so much. It's fascinating to people to think of giant people, supernatural beings that came as a result of the supernatural intermarrying with the natural, which already gives us a whole bunch of issues. It doesn't change where the text is headed, because the point was sin. The point was sin all over the place. It didn't matter if they were giant people or tiny little people. It didn't matter. There was sin, and that was the issue. There was the focus. But we still have to deal with it. It is believed, then, that these are the angels that are referenced in 1 Peter 3, 2 Peter 2, and Jude 1:6. Well, let's read the text. Now, try to look on these texts objectively. If you and I can look on the text we're about to read, and no one told us that these might be associated, I'm already ruining it, but you already know it, they might be associated with these angelic beings, which they're already sure of, which I don't think they ought to be, in Genesis chapter 6, and that's what is being described in these other texts. Let's see if that's as clear as some of these people make it out to be. 1 Peter chapter 3, starting at verse 18, for Christ also died for sins, once for all, the just for the unjust, in order that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which also he went and made proclamation to the spirits now in prison, who once were disobedient, when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Now, spirits that Jesus somehow preached to, and these were the spirits that are being discussed in the time of Noah, and yet Jesus went and I already have issues with that. If I even try to make this angelic beings who intermarried with these women the point, why say spirits here? And what exactly is it saying about these people? If you remember our study through 1 Peter, we kind of landed on the whole concept of what this was talking about. And the spirits there would have been the people alive during that time. The people. And then tried to go into great lengths to explain what it meant, this preaching to them, and how and what ultimately was that was describing. But I think it takes a great leap to reach the point where we would say, well, okay, these were the angelic beings who intermarried with the daughters of men. I don't think it's anywhere near clear enough. Well, okay, there's other texts, though. Let's see if it gets any better. How about 2 Peter 2? We'll start at verse 1. But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will also be false teachers among you, who will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing swift destruction upon themselves. Okay, so far so good. This is the false teachers in their day, false prophets in the old days, and then false teachers in our day. Verse 2, and many will follow their sensuality, and because of them the way of the truth will be maligned, because they will live for whatever feels good. That's what sensuality is. They will live according to how they feel. That's, I think, a very good way of handling the whole concept of sensuality, because that's what it's discussing. Now, we get to verse 3. And in their greed, they will exploit you with false words, these false teachers. Their judgment from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. Okay, he's talking about these people have a special condemnation and judgment upon them. For if God, and this is the verse in question here, if God did not spare angels when they sinned, God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to the pits of darkness reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought the flood upon the world. And then he goes on, if God didn't spare these angels when they left their first estate, as it were, or when they rebelled against God, and then the people in Noah's day when they rebelled against God, see the connection? See how clear it is? Clearly it's discussing angelic beings who intermarried with the daughters of men. I'm saying that sarcastically in case it's not clear. It's not nearly. And yet these are their solid proof texts for making this a case for these being angelic beings. Unless some of you are thinking, no, I see it looks pretty clear. It's not clear at all to me. I think it's a stretch. A big stretch. And that's not the only problem, these proof texts. We're going to go back to the text itself and try to make a couple more points. All right, well, let's see. There's one more here that is commonly used. Jude 1:6. We'll start at verse 5. Now I desire to remind you, though you know all things once for all, that the Lord, after saving a people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who did not believe, and angels who did not keep their own domain, which many people try to play off what that possibly means, but abandoned their proper abode, he has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Now that is somewhat of a perplexing text, a difficult text. But how do you tie it in directly, other than assuming, to this text in Genesis chapter 6? How do you make it fit? I don't think it's a clear fit at all. I can't explain exactly what that's referencing there, these angels that seem to have a special judgment upon them already. I mean, we could go on what the domain meant and the abode meant or whatever, but to say this is clearly dealing with those who intermarried, I think is a stretch. Big time in this text. So I don't think the 3 key proof texts that I hear repeated quite often, even by pastors that I still respect, even though I differ with them on this, I just can't just accept, I guess it must mean that. I can kind of see how you think that. I mean, I could see, I kind of used to think that, this, I guess, fits. For a long time, I figured it wasn't angels actually intermarrying. Even my professor in college, Tammy remembers Mr. Arndt, and I remember him covering this text in our doctrines class and saying, some people think it was angels. Because of our angelology and some of the other things that are mentioned about angels, it just doesn't seem likely. So they must have possessed these men and then married the women. And my thought was, okay, so why? Was it to make them more evil? This is the point I made last week. Mankind's just fine on being totally evil on their own without demons coming along and helping us. If I want to be somewhat mean, I would imagine even at times demons are probably impressed with how evil mankind can be on their own. And so it's not nearly as clear cut. So those are the texts there that are often used and associated then with what people try to pull in to their arguments here. Again, in verse 7 of Jude 1, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they, in the same way as these, indulged in gross immorality and went after strange flesh, are exhibited as an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. It just doesn't tie it to the angelic beings in Genesis chapter 6. At least I don't think in a comfortable way, not one that I'm going to have to totally alter my stance on angelology and then somehow balance it with Christ's statements in Matthew 22. So here's the problems I list in the notes here. The problems with this position are, number one, this presumes angels can procreate and would seem to be in contradiction with Matthew 22:30. And by the way, some people would say, well, we're not actually saying they're procreating. Well, the scripture doesn't say they possessed men, the sons of God possessed men, and they had relations with these women. It just says the sons of God married these women. That was a normal term for humanity. Jesus being asked about the whole situation with whose wife will somebody be, and other questions about eternity and who will be married and who's not married. And Matthew 22:30, neither, speaking of angels, neither marry nor are given in marriage as the angels of heaven. So there's at least one reference by our Lord, who would know more than any of us, could angels marry? And some people say, well, I don't know if it was marriage, but that term is ultimately used in a somewhat normal way in Genesis chapter 6, dealing with marriage. And the Lord says, I can't marry. So then all we're left is possession. And then I go back to, okay, it doesn't say they were possessed, and it doesn't do anything to help the text at all to think they were possessed. I think a far better explanation of this text here. Second issue, in all other uses of the term, quote, sons of God, which were used in Job there, as it is in Hebrew, are always referring to those that are good. And this would be the only exception. Now, I found out recently that there was another pastor that I respect, and I was listening to him cover this text, and when he talks about the sons of God in Job coming before the throne of God to present themselves, that since Satan was among them, that meant the others were demons. And I just have trouble accepting that in a huge way. Just because they could be the angels of God and Satan himself comes in the midst also then to openly challenge God does not give us any, I think, reasonable authority to say, well, then the sons of God must reference demons. It doesn't fit the term in its general usage. It doesn't fit the context. So to think that, well, in this context then, because of what's happening, then they must be demons, they must be evil, and they must be spirits, I don't see how you can have a solid case. Off to the left, this position with it being spirit beings or possessed people, this is a widely accepted view in many conservative circles. Many people that deal with Genesis will just accept this as the case and will use the other text in Peter and Jude to somehow give it the final support it needs to make the case. I put forward that it really doesn't make any difference, substantive difference in the text, because it's not the point of the text. If anything, it just messes us up. We come up with supernatural beings. It infects our angelology, and I think profoundly can distract if we run with this point. People love it. They're fascinated with it. The supernatural. Evil beings intermarrying and giant people, even though Nephilim can just mean people, as it says here in the New American Standard, important people, well-known people. We have Nephilim in that sense in our day. Nephilim were actually mentioned a long time after the flood, too. I don't see in those texts where it mentions there was intermarrying of angels with people again. So it's a widely accepted view and does have some textual and historical significance. Historical because there's a lot of people that will agree with it. The second point underneath that off to the left there is an oft reference to translation of, quote, angels in this text in the Septuagint, which is another one of the things that lent to it. One of the various translations of the Septuagint use the term angels in this text in the Septuagint, but it is in only one of them, at least from the research I had, only one of them, one of the underlying manuscripts, and not found in the older manuscripts in the Septuagint. I still think it's easy just to take what most people seem to say, and it's a bit dynamic, and boy, you can hold an audience. If you're talking about these supernatural giant beings, can you imagine how tall they were, how fearsome they were, and this perversion into the human line and the human DNA being perverted with this demonic seed, and that it's just making mankind even more dangerous? Boy, doesn't that sound like quite the story to follow. But it's not the point of the text anyway. So I try to sum this up a couple different ways, but point B, some believe, as I am more inclined to believe also, that this is in reference to the godly men in mankind. Possibly, it should say, more in the line of Seth and Enosh, there in Genesis 4:26, which I think sets up the entire flow of thought from Genesis 4 all the way through into Genesis chapter 6. And where everything was headed, the line, the people, their children, and then this separating of the lines, and now you've got an intermarrying of some sort taking place here in Genesis chapter 6. So that these groups, the godly men and mankind, possibly the line of Seth and Enosh, and that they intermarried indiscriminately with any of the daughters of men. That's a natural fit. Granted, I'll say sons of God. That does kind of throw people for a loop, but typically you're thinking to some degree in a normal handling of the phrase, even in light of the text in Job, that it meant to some degree people of God. And if they were truly good angels, they wouldn't have done these evil deeds. So the reference, this fits the overall context of Genesis 4 through 5, and it fits perfectly. It fits perfectly. The overall context of Genesis 4 through 5 and the special attention given to the lines of Seth in contrast to the line of Cain. The problems with this position are, just trying to be honest and open, the problems with this position are, number one, the reference, sons of God, is never used of people anywhere else in the Old Testament. That's a problem. That's a problem. Though there are similar phrases used of Israel, not this exact phrase, but similar phrases. So we could at least, if they're going to fudge it a little bit, if we fudge it a little bit, which I'm not trying to do, we could say, well, it was close to that type of phrasing that was used of Israel as contrasted to the rest of the people. Second problem, the line of Seth is never called the, quote, sons of God. And typical exegesis would look to the word and phrase usages establishing proper meaning and interpretation. Normally we would do that. Now, to try to give myself a little bit of leeway, Genesis is somewhat unique because it is a book of beginnings. It's a book of beginnings. We're finding firsts all throughout, unique scenarios that would never take place again. And that one of the things we're seeing in the book of Genesis. So, though, off to the left there, though this position may go against some basic normal tenets of exegesis, like the usage of the sons of God, and not finding another usage of it necessarily referring to people, it does follow these tenets, the tenets of exegesis regarding context. Context, because sometimes if there's something confusing, we deal with this in hermeneutics, in general exegesis. If you've got a problem text, a difficult text, sometimes one of the best ways to answer it, if your word definitions and your other cross-references aren't necessarily giving you a solid answer, then you look to its context. What fits its context, ideally? And my estimation is that making these angelic beings for whatever, even the pastor I mentioned, that solidly holds to these being angelic beings intermarrying, said up front in his sermon on Genesis chapter 6, I don't know why it's even mentioned. I don't know why it's even mentioned, but it is. And here it is, so we'll take it. It's Scripture at face value. My thought is to that, but if you take it in the stance of the godly line intermarrying with the ungodly line in an indiscriminate way of marrying, it fits the context beautifully. Beautifully, because you have a distinction of the lines in Genesis 4 and 5, and now suddenly you have why reference indiscriminate marrying. We were so caught up in the angelic beings versus natural people, but there was an indiscriminate marrying. They married whoever they wanted. And now suddenly everybody's evil. There's just evil all over the place. You got to ask, why are these things being mentioned? It's not just being mentioned so that we now have an interesting account of supernatural marrying with the natural. But if you go back to the context, say Cain's line, Adam's line through Seth, and even through Enosh, and then ultimately leading up to Noah, and now you get to the beginning of the flood and how evil it was. By the way, you've got two groups marrying, and the marriages are indiscriminate, whoever they want, and you've got evil. Very well-known, powerful people that come out of these indiscriminate marriages, and you've got really wicked evil, to overstate something. That's the scenario. Yes, Matt?
Just wondering, maybe the wording is reflecting the authority structure that God has put in place. The head of woman is man, as a man is Christ, in this case God. I'm just throwing that out there as an idea.
Possibly. My inclination, though, is still more to lean toward the... you just look at a text and you think, what really is the tricky part in the text? If I get past whoever the sons of God are, and I focus on it, sure seems like the point was indiscriminate marrying. And people tried to make a big deal out of the marriage and saying, well, it can't be true marriage because angels don't marry, had to be possession, and it was just sexual immorality. Well, that doesn't fit with the normal handling of the phrasing there either. It's got to be some kind of marriage. And it was indiscriminate, and then you got evil. I just keep making those connections and thinking, it just seems like the most plain handling of the text, even though I can't rightfully explain to the critics, but why use sons of God? Why use sons of God? I feel more comfortable, though, with my stance, way more comfortable than I do the angelic beings. So we're not done yet, though. I mentioned the problems. So again, off to the left of point B there, though this position may go against some basic exegesis, it does follow the tenets regarding context. I think that's strong, as I like to emphasize in our hermeneutics teaching. Context is king. It's very important. Context is king. So if you're having trouble, it's a great thing to go back to try to see what best fits context to the best of our ability. So to believe that the sons of God must be angels here is to make this text the only text that indicates angels can procreate, which is shaky exegesis, and that's generous. I would actually be more inclined to say that is dangerous exegesis. Dangerous, because you still can't make the text in Jude and in Peter actually mean they procreated. It sure looks like it's associated only if we are confident that this is an intermarrying of the supernatural angelic beings with humanity. And that's shaky, to be generous exegesis. Dangerous exegesis, I believe. Because part of my study, and I kind of resent having to go through it, but I think it may sound like I'm just nervous about it and trying to avoid the topic. So I had a decision to make some years ago when I put this together. I'm just going to deal with it and then try to pull it all back to say, almost a waste of time that we had to deal with all that stuff because it was never the point of the text. And that's always the important thing for us to pursue. Yes, Matt?
It doesn't seem right that this chapter, these verses, could not be interpreted without 1st and 2nd Peter and Jude.
Yeah.
Not possible.
It would be a problem. Though to be fair, historically, long before some of these others came on, there was a speculation into, like I mentioned, one of the Septuagint translations there, that this was angels. This was angels. Well, let's move on. Almost through the worst of it here. Point C, fortunately. Looking forward to that point. Fortunately, this debate has no bearing on the subject of the text at large. And I'm open to question or debate about that one, but you don't stand a chance. That's not the point of the text, unless you've got a warped way of reading Scripture. It's not the point of the text. This debate has no bearing on the subject of the text at large, and that being the point, that being the reasons leading up to the deluge, the flood. There will continue to be honest debate as to who or whomever the sons of God really are, but there is no debate whatsoever, which is why we're safe to just totally focus on this as the majority of our focus. There is no debate as to the degeneracy of mankind. There's the problem. Boy, wouldn't it be nice if we as mankind, and part of me, in my conspiratorial side, thinks, I know what's going on here. Notice the clenched teeth. I know what's going on here. They're still trying to make mankind look somewhat innocent, and oh, poor mankind. We would have been pretty good if these angels hadn't interfered and made us wicked. We already see who gets the credit for wickedness. Satan was the only one that seemed to have some part in it, but Adam and Eve were the ones that brought it in, because Paul in Romans 5 doesn't say sin entered the world through Satan. Wherefore is by one man sin entered the world. So that part of me even suspects we just want to keep protecting mankind as much as we can so that we don't look as evil. Those pesky demons made us do it. Think how saintly we would be if we didn't have those devils making us even more evil. Oh no, that excuse won't stand up before the throne of God. So there will be, and will continue to be, a debate about who those were, but no debate about the degeneracy of mankind to such a low level that evil and debased thoughts had become the overriding topic of the thoughts of their society. That just was what people thought about was evil. Sin. It was their thinking and their intentions. So point D, it is important that we realize without the intervention of God, all societies will head in this direction, yes, including the United States. Without the direct intervention of God, we will become perverse and more wicked, till soon every thought would be as evil as it possibly could be continually. Just like Romans 1 points out. And what happens when people think they're getting away with their sin, God is giving them over to it. That is judgment, not His overlooking it, and certainly not His blessing. We do not want to get away with sin. We think we do, but Romans 1's the perfect warning that no, that is a horrible judgment when God just lets you over to your sin. And yet you even have a lot of professing Christians, or maybe even real Christians, looking on in the sinful world, especially those that seem to have been Christians, and then they finally are freed up to do whatever they want, and they look on with an envious gaze. That is stupid in its fullest sense in the spiritual world. Just totally stupid thinking. I'm trying to think of the strongest word I can. To look on that with envy. Those people being judged ultimately. Just give it time. The problem is we don't have much time to see its end. It's never pleasant. Everybody dies. Everybody dies. So if they seem to live their lives for whatever, if you've ever been around when somebody dies, it's never a pleasant sight. Even if it's someone godly or whatever, it ends ultimately in death. That's all it can bring. Sin, when it is finished, as James pointed out, brings forth death. That's all it can offer in the end. It cannot offer anything else. And death in the truest sense. So point number 3, it is significant, top of page 48, it is significant to consider the initial conduit of this downward process. And now I want to focus on the context here of Genesis 6. So significant to consider the initial conduit of this downward process. What was the actual conduit? Not the angelic beings. The conduit was indiscriminate marrying, because that's what's mentioned here, indiscriminate marrying, that the sons of God, verse 2, saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Why say it that way? Don't we choose whoever we want? in the truest responsible sense, the answer to that is no. We don't. Now, does that mean I married Tammy and I didn't want to? No. That wasn't the case at all, but there was more to it. It's what you're looking for. One of the things I'm grateful for, just speaking now in practical terms, is how I was brought up in what to look for in a wife. Don't just look at what they look like. There's so much more to it, so much more than just the appearance. What is their character? What is their drive? What is their focus? What are they looking for in life? And I remember even thinking about that as a young man. I was 17 when I met Tammy, and the first thing that genuinely attracted me to her, and I know I'm not the only example, but this is just an example. First time I remember seeing her and hearing her was in that speech class, our first session of speech class, our freshman year, and we had to give our testimonies. And most people get up and give their testimonies. Well, that's kind of nice. Nice to be surrounded by Christians. And Tammy gave hers, and I remember thinking, wow, she's impressive. Because she was so excited about her testimony. She was interested in what she was saying. She stood out to me. That was one of the first things that attracted me to her. She looked good too, obviously, but that wasn't the only thing to me. And then I got to know her more and loved what I saw. That there was a love of God, a desire to search after God. You were always wondering, I don't know if this is real or not. But we dated for many years, and it became absolutely clear that she was truly God-focused. And she wanted her life set aside for that as its core purpose. And that was unbearably attractive. And I had been brought up to look for that. Oftentimes, guys will look for a girl, boy, she is just good looking. And they can overlook a lot of character issues just because she looks pretty good. Well, looks don't last. I'm not saying that we have to get ugly as we get older, but still, looks just don't last. But boy, that person should just grow more and more as you grow older, and the things that attract you to there, especially the godliness and the unity that comes in the ultimate goal of whatever dating would be or courtship or whatever, the oneness of spirit. That's the most important part, because that's what you're marrying. You're not marrying a body, you're marrying a person and their spirit there. So it's very important that this become a high priority. And what we mean then by they marry whomever they chose, we know it's not a positive thing in this context, because look where it leads. Indiscriminate marrying by those who are generally considered godly, they set aside that for God's purposes, like Solomon. If that's set aside, it leads to a distracted life, no longer focused on God, but more focused on the flesh. And that's a broad category, the flesh. Sometimes people will marry and there's not even a physical attraction there. It's just something else about the person. There's something else about the person. I've known of several women over the last couple decades that I've heard about that have left their husbands, or young ladies that have gone after men because they were dangerous, kind of seeming fun-loving or whatever, and the risky side of life. And you're thinking, what are you thinking? But they find that so attractive. And it's just that indiscriminate, I would put another word to help us understand this indiscriminate marrying. It would be more of an irresponsible marrying, one that's not focused on its responsibility. Because we might just come together and think, wow, you look good, I look good, you love me, I love you, I love that you love me, so wow, we love each other. And then children come along and we find out we don't have much of substance in common. And what happens to our children? What happens to our children? Now, that can be, you can rebound from that. My parents are an example of that, where they're just not a good marriage. It was horrible. But they rebounded and grew close again. And fortunately, most of that took place when we were young, and it had a tremendous impact on our focus and moving forward. Point A, the first draw for these sons of God was the beauty of these women. They were clearly very attractive. It is natural to be taken with what is beautiful and attractive. God's kind of the way designed us that way. But our sense and thoughtfulness is supposed to help us see beyond just the surface. We will see the surface, I admit that. That's a common thing. You kind of think, well, they look good, but there's so much more beyond that. Lots of people look good, but they're not attractive in the truest sense for many reasons. So we need help seeing beyond the surface, and this sense should be motivated with purpose founded upon being taught the truth of who and what we are primarily before God. There's our main focus. I want to see past these other things, look for the godliness in others. So young people, if I can try to influence anything, as foreign as this may seem at different times, you look for godliness in a potential mate first. Godliness. And if you just find them hideously ugly, or you just can't get along because they're just personalities conflict, it doesn't mean you have to marry somebody because they're godly. But if you're ever going to consider marriage to any degree, this is tops. And when I mean godly, I don't mean religious. I think they will be religious, but not just religion. Godly, and that's what drives them. That's what they live for. That's what their focus is. And that's oddly missing with so many people. I don't mean to pick on too many people just on their own, but sometimes I feel, because I'm a guy, fear to pick on guys. I had to do some work, brief work, just helping out with a particular video project for the City Rescue Mission, and went there to one afternoon to do some video work with my drone. It was a good excuse to play with a toy. So I was getting it all set up, and we were doing a couple shots, and there were two young ladies at work for the mission, and I was working with them to set up the shots, and they had some kids there for the shot they were doing, and then we wanted to take some other just extra footage that they might need. So the kids were playing, and I was there with those two young ladies, and we were talking, and the conversation drifted, and I don't think I steered it there, but it drifted toward their perspective of there's just not much to choose from with guys. They just don't grow up, was their point. Now, that just sounds horrible. Well, when you marry, you're not looking to marry out of mercy. I hope not. It just seemed like there's just not much of a selection out there. I mean, there's a lot of guys, they seem fairly decent. And I think these young ladies seem to have pretty good focus. One of them I've known for years since she was a little girl. I know her family really well. And they just said, we just don't find guys that are really, really focused before God. There just doesn't seem to be that many. They got all these other things. Might be good looking, might have a pretty good career or whatever, but they don't seem to be sold out for these things. And neither one of them, to their credit, had any inclination to just settle. They may never get married, they thought. So I was bold, and maybe I shouldn't have done it, but I was walking back with him, and I was chatting still about the topic, and I said, well, do you mind if I ask how old you are? To one of the young ladies. She said, I'm 38. I said, that's not bad. That's not too bad. I don't know if that was any point of encouragement at all. But I'm 38. And no prospect with the guys. And I'm thinking, you know how many people would come alongside and say, you're just too picky. You're just too picky. Well, texts like this and plenty of others. Plenty of others. And not just texts like this, but other human examples or marriages of examples that we've seen in our lifetimes around us should warn us, you better be discriminating before you think about marriage. You want to give it a lot of thought, and you want to be ultra picky about who you marry. And I firmly agree with that. Better to not marry at all than to settle on any account. Now, you're never going to marry somebody perfect, obviously. But where is the heart? Where is the focus? What is their life purpose? And that's what we're looking for. Because we see the ultimate consequences here, and I'm still impressed with the idea that they married whomsoever they wanted. So the first draw for the sons of God was the beauty of these women. It is natural, of course, to be taken with beauty, but we're supposed to be able to see past the surface. This sense should be motivated with purpose founded upon being taught the truth of who and what we primarily are before God, and not just in our own instinctive estimation. Instinctive estimation. I just find them attractive. I can't explain it. So many people say that. I just found them attractive. I don't know the mysteries of love. I don't know the mysteries of attraction. Philosophers and scientists are all trying to figure out. We just don't know. It just happened and we fell in love. I just think language like that may seem romantic to some, but it's awfully irresponsible. If you lose your head truly in the pursuit of someone to marry, you're not in good shape. You're not in good shape to truly lose your head. Sooner or later, hopefully you're brought back to focus on what this is all about. It's not just about me being happy. It's about responsibility. And hopefully, if we're discriminating enough, I'll be happy in my responsibility. I'll be fulfilled in my responsibility. Marriage can be a wonderful thing, so satisfying, so contenting, so joyful, a relationship that's there. But it can also be one of the most horrific, scary, depressing situations someone ever finds himself in. It's one of the most painful things you can ever face. And sadly, our society says, well, just divorce them and find somebody else. And there's where we mock and tear apart God's institution for all our seeming reasons. Off to the left, see the counsel, we'll end with this, of Proverbs Chapter 6. Proverbs Chapter 6. Just a couple verses here. And this is not a looking for a good marriage text. This is a text warning you of just pursuing just the physically attractive or things, the sensual side of this. Proverbs 6, verse 24. Verse 23. For the commandment is a lamp, and the teaching is light, and reproofs for discipline are the way of life. Well, none of us like that, but this is again for young people. The light to show the way, the reproofs, the discipline. Who likes that? Well, that's to direct you properly in the way of life. Why? Why is this important? Well, look at the first thing up. To keep you from the evil woman, he tells his son. This is why we're giving you these commandments and these lights of life, to keep you away from the immoral, the Old English has the strange woman, to keep you away from her. That's why we're giving you these things, so you're not lured in by these types, in this case of women, to keep you from the evil woman, from the smooth tongue of the adulteress. Someone who's already in a relationship, that's already married, she can sweet talk you, flatter you. Verse 25, do not desire her beauty in your heart, nor let her catch you with her eyelids. For, verse 26, on account of a harlot, one is reduced to a loaf of bread, and an adulteress hunts for the precious life. She goes to devour you. To devour you. My dad, he didn't do this with me, but he did it with my younger brother, and it stood out to him. He's talked about it several times. He was in some store, and he said, Dad said something really weird to him. Kind of where you start questioning, I wonder if he's losing it. But they were standing in a store, and he said, Dad pointed to a mannequin of a woman and said, David, she hates you. That was a weird thing to say. Number one, it's not real. So what's the point? And then he was trying to get on to the point here of the immoral woman. Looks good, makes you feel good, flatters you, smooth talker. She'll reduce you to nothing. And don't be fooled. She's looking for the significant life. That's the precious life, the important life. She'll go after people that have responsibility. It's one of the treasures of evil is to break up families. God's unit. Any way possible, break up that unit through some form of adultery or something like that. Destroy it, break it up. That's one of the ideas there of the strange woman looking to destroy precious life. Because none of us can get out of this without hurting other people if we're irresponsible. So it's all interconnected. We'll build on this more because this is not done, but we'll build on this more next week and then get into then what were the repercussions of this, and it's not a pretty thing. The last thing I want to do is compound my evil in my offspring. We work to do the opposite. It's no surprise to us when we see sin in our children, is it? No, it's no surprise. No surprise to us. But it is certainly our effort to not condone it, but to work our children past it, out of it, focused on something else. And even part of this, in light of this text, is even preparing them in the thought of how they will think about marriage in the future. And this is one of many texts that can be used in how they should think about it. What are we really looking for? Because sometimes, and this is a word of warning, it's not always necessarily a warning, but oftentimes it is. Sometimes the most attractive thing you will see in a potential mate is that they like you. Sometimes that's the number one requirement. That's what I find attractive. You kind of try the, how do I say it? You try the door, and finally you find someone that at least has some interest and you think, whoa, I love this person. Not realizing that at our core, we love them because they love us. We like them because they like us. Be so careful in how you think this thing through. Most people aren't doing it anymore. They set their hopes, their joys, their happiness on who they're going to marry, and they try as fast as possible to find somebody and get married as though somehow that will meet the core need of their life, and they are wrong. Marriage will meet a need, but marriage is an awesome responsibility. It's an awesome responsibility, not just because of the children, that's huge, not just because you're now taking responsibility for somebody else, but because it's God's institution. It's God's institution. Divorce is high rates and adultery are high rates because we treat it like it's for us, like it's ours. But it's not. It's God's. And better to get back to the grassroots of this concept rather than just keep fudging it because our society and our churches are going the wrong direction and we just don't want to counter anybody's feelings on this one. But we have to, especially for our young people. I don't know how many times I told other people, especially when I had that youth group, please come speak to our teenagers. And several of the women in particular that I asked to at least share their testimony said, I won't do it, I can't. And I understood. I wasn't trying to be overbearing. Believe me, I understood it. And I said, it would just help to say, here's what I was thinking. And here's what I was feeling. And I got married. And it just seemed like the right thing. And it didn't take long to realize, wow, this is just not it. And it's just been a weight and every odd situation. I think almost all the teenagers, I think there was a couple exceptions in my youth group, had divorce in their background. Not them, but their parents that had divorce and the pains that came with it. And what's remarkable is to see how many people that come from divorced families, this is my own experience, so it's certainly not provable across the board, but it's remarkable to me to see how many people came from divorced families or families where the marriages were really tough and the relationship wasn't good, and they end up reproducing it in their own marriages. I don't understand it. It seems like they would want to contradict it or counter it another way, but they end up bringing the same baggage with them into their own marriage and never countering it, never trying to fix it. And normally I'd say most of these just aren't workable if God hadn't let us see an impossible situation work its way out with my parents. So I know, at least from that experience, it's doable. So we'll build on this more next week. I wanted to just play off of that a little bit because don't get to talk about that topic much. And then brace yourself. Evil thoughts of man continually, and then what's ultimately going to continue, and then the flood itself and the significance of that, and even maybe dabbling a little bit into the concept of people even denying a worldwide flood based on a poor handling of seeming science these days. Let's pray. Father, thank you. Thank you for even how you give us warnings by the examples of what has come before us. Please help us all here never to think of ourselves as the exception to your rule, your word especially, but would be those who take you at your word, who trust you in it, who will even go against our instincts at times to follow you, to follow your example, to heed your warnings, even the examples that give us warning, so that we can be wise stewards of the life, the time that you've given us while we are under the sun. This we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.